Friends, we live in an age where we are inundated with comic book movies. Marvel's putting out multiple films a year, DC is getting ready for a huge revamp with the arrival of James Gunn, and Sony is doing whatever the hell Sony's doing. Some of these films are great, some of these films are not so great, and some of these films are Morbius. But regardless of your taste, comic book nerds have been feasting for the last 15 years. But there was a time when I was a kid when comic book movies were something of a rarity and a total crapshoot of quality. But there was one film, along with Batman in 1989, that showed us how great comic book movies could be and laid the groundwork for everything we appreciate and enjoy today. Welcome aboard Space Castle, where our continuing mission is to search the universe for all things nerdy. I'm your Captain DT, and friends, two very important things happened in the year 1983. First of all, I was born. Second of all, two comic authors in Massachusetts named Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird would begin sketching turtles wearing bandanas holding nunchucks as a private joke. And that private joke would turn into one of the most prominent and enduring pop culture phenomena still to this day. Yep, that little joke between two buddies hanging out drinking beers one night turned into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and an absolute juggernaut and empire of action figures and sleeping bags and lunchboxes and a really terrible cereal that nobody actually really liked but we all pretended to, and eventually a live action film. So it's 1988 and comic book movies are at an all-time low. The Superman franchise is well run out of steam at this point, and the only comic book movies coming out in theaters are sort of B-movie novelties like Swamp Thing or Howard the Duck. Now, the Ninja Turtles are already a well-established franchise at this point, with incredible action figure sales and a wildly popular cartoon series, but still, no major studio would touch a live-action adaptation of a comic book property. They were viewed as tainted at this point, and to make matters worse, Masters of the Universe, which I personally love, had just bombed at the box office, and nobody wanted to touch a movie based on a toy line either. It wasn't until a man named Gary Proper, who weirdly enough was Gallagher's road manager, that Gallagher, he got together with a producer named Kim Dawson and a screenwriter named Bobby Herbeck. They put their heads together and they convinced a studio called Golden Harvest to produce the film. Now, Golden Harvest as a production studio was mostly known at the time for producing a number of Jackie Chan films, and it seemed to make perfect sense given that the Ninja Turtles kind of combine martial arts action with heart and humor, and it mostly takes place on a street level, or beneath the streets as it were, characteristics that they share with many Jackie Chan films. A modest budget of $13 million was set, and a screenplay was in place after some effort convincing Eastman and Laird, who were really protective of their babies and wanted to make sure any live-action movie made would do right by their intellectual property. Steve Barron, who very famously directed Michael Jackson's Billie Jean video and a-ha's Take on Me, was set to direct, and Jim Henson's Creature Shop was tasked with bringing Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Splinter to life. And the result is still, to this very day, what I consider to be the most accurate and successful comic book adaptation film to have ever been made. Set in what was then present-day Manhattan, the story is of course about four teenage turtle brothers and their mutant rat father figure as they navigate life while keeping their own existence a secret. Which they do by blaring the champs at high volumes, going out to movies at peak evening hours, and having pizzas delivered down storm drains. New York City was f***ing weird in the 80s, so they could get away with all of this without anyone really looking into it too closely. Anyway, their quiet existence is interrupted when they happen upon TV news reporter April O'Neil being mugged by members of a street gang. They quickly and quietly come to the rescue without being seen, except for Raphael's Sai accidentally being left behind. Now, I was already a huge Ninja Turtle fan at this point. I was 6 years old when this movie came out, and I had a sizable collection of action figures and pajamas and toothbrushes and t-shirts and cereal bowls and I was obsessed. Going to see this movie was a really, really big deal. And April notices Raphael's forgotten Sai and slips it into her purse before he can retrieve it. The Sai was no doubt given to him by his father, who trained him his whole life to use it, and I'm sure it had crazy sentimental value to him. He looks on from the safety of a manhole cover as he loses like 50% of his identity, and okay, let's get this out of the way early. This is gonna shock and surprise you, and you need a brief interlude to prepare yourself mentally. Raphael said, "Damn." A Ninja Turtle said a bad word, and it was all I could do to gasp audibly in the theater and look up at my dad in awe and wonder. A Ninja Turtle said a bad word. My dad refused to look back down at me, for he had no explanation as to why my hero had just blurted out a D-bomb in the first 2 minutes of a kid's movie. And that's the beauty of 1990s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This wasn't just a kid's movie. This was a movie that absolutely did adopt aspects of the cheerful and colorful cartoon series, but it also borrowed heavily from the much darker, much more serious comic book origins of the characters, and flawlessly blended the two. But let's get back to Jim Henson's Creature Shop, because no amount of great writing and direction would have helped this movie land if the turtles themselves didn't work on screen. Jim Henson, being the massive advocate for children's safety, development, and education that he was incredibly hesitant to take part in the production. He thought the premise was much too violent, but he had a working relationship with director Steve Barron from Henson's The Storyteller TV series, and he was able to be convinced to create the Turtles under the promise that the violence propelled a story about family, acceptance, and coming of age. The Turtles and Splinter were, according to Henson himself, the most elaborate and complex projects he and his people had ever produced. Full-body costumes with myriad animatronics in the heads controlling the eyes and mouths of the Turtles to produce a wide variety of expressions, and a multi-puppeteered Splinter rig propelled the animatronics industry and set a whole new standard for it. Friends, this shit should not have worked. 4 below-average height performers wearing rubber suits with bulky heads dancing and doing martial arts moves should not have worked at all. If not for the absolute genius of Jim Henson and his studio, this movie would have looked ridiculous. But instead, we got 4 15-year-old walking, talking turtles and a giant rat that are still, more than 33 years later, a marvel. And it's also due in no small part to Steve Barron's direction. The man performed a miracle in making the premise and the characters believable, and adopting the dark and gritty feel of the comic line was a masterstroke. The heavy shadows, the desaturated feel of the film, and the way it's all shot on camera lend themselves towards hiding the seams and making the Turtles feel like an organic part of the world around them. But you're thinking, yeah, great, the film looks awesome, lots of movies look awesome. Why in the world are you saying it's the greatest comic adaptation ever?
Yes, I was thinking all those things, and also, why I haven't given up on you getting to the f***ing point and, just opening up the airlock.
Okay. The reason why 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is still the greatest comic book adaptation of all time is because it approaches the characters and the story with honesty, nuance, and genuine authenticity. It was no small task in combining the juvenile silliness of the cartoon with the gritty, dark, and serious tones of the original comic books, but Steve Barron and his crew nailed it. Michelangelo is still very much the party dude, but he's also a character with subtle layers and insecurities. And his humor is often a deflection of inner turmoil and his inability to deal with some heavy shit. There's a scene early on in the film where Splinter lectures the 4 turtles about being safe and careful because he won't always be there to guide them. Donatello later approaches Michelangelo about this, and Michelangelo just in turn makes a joke about the pizza guy being late.
Time's up. $3 off.
When I was a little kid, I thought this was just Mikey being the pizza-obsessed, flighty surfer dude we all knew and loved. But as I got older, I realized it was him deflecting having to entertain the painful thought of his father being gone. In Red Letter Media, I made this observation before you did. Before you did your Rewind episode, which I actually love, I was a guest on an absolutely lovely podcast called We Watched a Thing, where I spoke at length about how wonderful this scene is. And it's not a betrayal of who we know Michelangelo to be. It's a very smart and lovely adaptation of it for the purposes of giving the character depth and making him feel more alive and 15 years old. And then there's Raphael, who is perhaps the centerpiece of the film, and rightly so because he is the best turtle. Fight me. Raphael was always cool but rude and sarcastic and always cracking jokes and having a gruff attitude, and this film wonderfully adapts that into Raphael being wildly insecure and angry and not having an outlet for that anger. This is a character who has to live in a sewer. He knows he's a freak of nature, he'll probably never have a girlfriend, and he's chafing inside this cloistered existence. And he turns that anger both inward and outward, and he chooses to face it alone because he can't open up to his brothers about it. And it perpetually puts a strain on their relationships. There's an absolutely beautiful scene early on in the film where Raphael leaves the den to wander alone topside, and Splinter is waiting for him when he comes home. Splinter practically begs and pleads with him to let him help. Raphael has all of this anger, and Splinter has tried to channel it and help him process it, but it's endless. And Raphael breaks into tears because he doesn't know the answer either. These two characters clearly love each other as father and son, but there's a wall between them that neither of them can climb over. Raphael is tormented by his own existence, and it's not until he's forced to be without Splinter, find a way to reconcile the rift between him and Leonardo, and strive towards a common goal with his brothers, that he really starts to feel at ease in his own shell and come into his own. And man, if that's not a perfect distillation of the experience of being a teenager and an outsider, I don't know what is. And it's done in a Muppet movie about comic book characters. 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is a comic book movie that makes no concessions or compromises in adapting its source material. There's some alterations made, but none of them feel like a betrayal of the spirit of the original product. No one acts wildly out of character for the sake of plot or entertainment. There's no fundamental disregard of the core tenets of the characters, like, say, Batman just killing a bunch of people in 1989's Batman or in Batman Returns. Yeah, I went there. Sorry, Batman doesn't kill people. It's literally what makes him Batman. And the tone and seriousness of the film scared the out of everyone. No major studio would pick this movie up for distribution. Disney passed on it. Warner Brothers passed on it, even though they've since picked up the DVD and Blu-ray rights. MGM, Fox, the list goes on. No one would pick this up until New Line Cinema came along. New Line Cinema came on board and they picked up the distribution rights halfway through this movie's principal photography. So yeah, this movie was actually in serious danger of not finding its way into theaters when it was finished. But New Line was a scrappy little independent distributor and mostly known for putting out the Nightmare on Elm Street films. Which, as an aside, is actually kind of funny. The New Line Cinema logo is such a visceral part of my childhood. This logo could either mean absolute joy with a Ninja Turtles movie or the heralding of Freddy Krueger, who I was absolutely goddamn terrified of and who haunted my nightmares until I was like 34 years old. I'm just kidding. I still have the nightmares. Golden Harvest freaked out at how dark the movie was, both tonally and visually, and ended up firing Steve Barron in post-production. Which is kind of a weird flex because the movie was already filmed at that time. I don't know if there was a situation like with Rogue One where the director was removed and the film was edited to be more towards the studio's liking, because the entire film is pretty dark in tone and look for a Ninja Turtles movie. Oh, and speaking of editing, Golden Harvest also fired the film's editor because they were unhappy with her work too. That woman was... Okay, in a rare double instance, I'm going to give you another brief interlude to prepare yourself mentally because this is gonna blow your mind. That woman was Sally Menke, who would go on to be Quentin Tarantino's editor for all of his films before her untimely passing in 2010. The woman who was nominated for an Oscar for editing Pulp Fiction, which still to this day is one of the seminal examples of brilliant film editing. This lady was the primary editor for a Ninja Turtles movie, and she was fired because the studio didn't like her work. This woman would go on to receive multiple Oscar nominations for her work and would have a decorated award-winning career. Dudes, this movie scared the out of everyone. Everyone was horrified by what they had put all this money into, and they thought Steve Barron had ruined careers by making this dark, brooding, emotional, and thoughtful Ninja Turtles movie. And then the thing came out, and it became the most successful independent film in history. It was the second biggest US opening for a film ever, and it is still, over 30 years later, praised as being perhaps the quintessential take on the characters and the touchstone of how to do the franchise justice. It's the pinnacle of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise and the potential for it to tell deep, honest, and touching stories. Steve Barron, with incredible help from a great cast and crew and the skill of Jim Henson's Creature Shop, did the unthinkable and not only made an excellent film out of an absurd concept that started out as a joke between friends, he also helped set the stage for legitimacy for comic book movies and ran so that Marvel and DC could walk today. Or stumble around drunkenly in Sony's case. 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is still to this day objectively the best comic book film ever made. Its refusal to compromise its characters and its story and its keen understanding of what does and doesn't work for the franchise are things that still elude filmmakers to this day whenever they try and make an adaptation of their own. I really hope that Seth Rogen, Jeff Rowe, and Kyler Spears have taken special consideration with Mutant Mayhem, but if not, at least we'll always have the magic that was a 1990 movie. Thanks so much for hanging out with me once again in Deep Space. Here on Space Castle, it's our continuing mission to search the universe for all things nerdy, and just by watching this video, you are helping keep me adrift out here in the cosmos. If you want to add a little extra juice to the Lightspeed engine, you can like and subscribe. You can also leave a comment down below. I want to read everyone's thoughts and their first memories of seeing this film. And if you haven't seen this movie before, go and watch it and then come back and leave a comment and let me know how you liked it. I'll wait. And be sure to share this video with a friend and become part of the Galactonaut team. This is your Captain DT, signing off.
You forgot to talk about how badass they managed to make Shredder in this movie.
Fuck!